Hello, and welcome to this video lecture of Chapter 17, an overview of Agile project management. So our agenda for this lesson is first, introduction to Agile project management. Second, we'll talk about the Scrum process. And thirdly, a comparison of traditional and Agile project management. Now, first of all, in an introduction to what is called Agile and in the form of Agile project management. For many projects, the process of developing a plan and then executing the plan is appropriate. That is, the traditional project management techniques and project lifecycle that we've studied so far in the course. For many projects, this is absolutely the best way to do it. However, there are some types of projects, and the best example is software development, where these traditional models are not as effective. And one of the key reasons is that it is difficult to determine exactly what you want to do ahead of time when it's something like software. And there are other types of projects that are similar to this, but it's primarily in software where the traditional waterfall project management has some difficulties. This has led to the development of Agile project management methods. And there are many Agile frameworks. There are many different Agile. There is Kanban, Lean, and Scrum, as amongst others. This course will focus on the Scrum framework for a couple of reasons. One is it's because this is an introduction. It's one chapter of the textbook. We really won't be studying all of the different permutations of Agile. And secondly, Scrum is very popular and very representative of how how Agile works. So it's a good one to use. So let's proceed. Scrum is based on the following process. And the word Scrum comes from, as you can see in this picture on the right, the Scrum is an aspect of rugby where everyone is together and kind of pushing and working with each other. And so the metaphor of Scrum was used by the originators of this framework. During Scrum, a number of iterations occur, known as sprints, and they are performed by the Scrum team. Each sprint is brief, usually lasting from 1 to 4 weeks. During a project, each sprint is always the same number of weeks. So if a sprint is defined to be 1 week in a particular project, all sprints will be 1 week. Likewise, if it was 2 weeks, all sprints would be 2 weeks during the project. Now, during each sprint, the following takes place. Sprint planning is the first step. This is followed by development work with stand-up meetings that occur each day. There's a sprint review. And then finally, there's a sprint retrospective. And then it repeats itself. As I mentioned earlier, there are iterations. So these 4 steps repeat over and over. Now, in terms of size, in a typical sprint, and again, there's no absolute one way to do so. But if let's say that we are doing 1 week sprints in a project, and the case study project that is going to be followed in using Scrum has a 1 week sprint. So in that instance, if with a 1 week sprint, the sprint planning would typically be about half a day. The development work would be the majority of the week, that is the 5 days. So it would probably be a good 3.5 to 4 days. The sprint review would be an hour or two, and the sprint retrospective would likely be about an hour or so. And that gives you more or less the relative percentages. So you can see that development work is the majority. So let's run through each of those. Now, first of all, like all projects, they need to start. They need to initiate with project initiation. So at this point, I'm going to direct you to the case study update starts on page 198 for project initiation. And so our Scrum project is going to initiate. Now, you should take this moment to pause this video and read the case study on page 198. Now, one of the things you'll find is that through the magic of writing, the case study project, the DecoCam project, is we are going to redo it. This one chapter, we pretend it didn't happen using traditional project management, and we're going to see what it looks like using Scrum. So we're going to set the clock back and restart it using Scrum. Now, what you'll find in project initiation is that it works basically the same. There needs to be a project sponsor. It needs to be initiated through possibly a business case and project charter and so on. So the initiation looks pretty much the same. So anyways, I will just stop here. You can read the case study for project initiation and then come on back here. Okay, so moving on. The next thing we want to look at is the Scrum team. Now, the roles on a Scrum team are different than a traditional project management team. The roles are, there's three main types of roles. There is a product owner, that is a representative of the business who is the voice of the business. So instead of the project team going out, if you remember back to requirements definition, where project teams would go out and talk to different stakeholders and so on, that's the role of the product owner. They are the voice of the business, and will represent their needs. The second role is the development team. These are the individuals who are responsible for actually completing the work of each sprint. They are generally a self-directed, cross-functional team that complete all aspects of the work. And finally, there is a Scrum Master, where a Scrum Master is responsible for ensuring Scrum processes are understood and followed. This would be most closely associated with a project manager in traditional project management, but it's clearly a different role. The Scrum Master does not direct the work of the development team like they would on traditional projects. Instead, they are there to guide in terms of process, as well as clear any obstacles that the development team may be experiencing. So those roles are very different. At this point, please pause this video and read the Scrum Team case study update on page 199. So please pause now and come on back once you've done that. Okay, so we are back, and during that case study update, you may have noticed that all of the familiar names from the previous project team in the other chapters are now part of either a product owner, which is Jason. The development team was Chris, Sarah, Maddie, and Eli. And the Scrum Master is Sophie. And you got a sense for what each of them would do in the Scrum team in terms of their roles. Okay, so let's move on. We're now going to move on to the first step of the sprint, and that being sprint planning. It is held at the start of the sprint. So if we assume a sprint starts on a Monday, which is usually a good idea, the sprint planning meeting would be held first thing Monday morning. During that meetings, the purpose of it is to select items from what is known as the product backlog. The product backlog are all of the things that the business would like possibly implemented as part of this project. Now, normally, the number of items on a product backlog far exceed what can be done in any one sprint. So at best, we can select some of them. And so that is the purpose during the sprint planning meeting. Now, this is one of the areas where Scrum differs from traditional project management. it's not the product owner or the scrum master that select the items and indicate to the development team what they should do. Instead, the development team provides is the development team in effect uh, uh, together with working with the product owner will indicate those items from the product backlog which can and should be included into the sprint. They may be considering the dependencies of what should be done first, what can be done, and so on. So there's sometimes a relative order of them. We talked about dependencies earlier in the course. No doubt the product owner will be providing the urgency and priority of items, so we'll certainly have a large voice, but the development team has a much bigger role in the selection of what is to be included and or what items of the product backlogs are to be selected and included in the sprint. The items that are selected are listed in what is called the sprint backlog. That is now a subset of the product backlog that will be performed during the sprint and represent and become the sprint goal. The objective of the sprint now becomes the accomplishment of the sprint goal in order to create what is called the product increment. That is, at the end of each sprint, is now our updated product, which is called the product increment. And the idea of Scrum is that at the end of each sprint, we should have something which is usable that could be used by the business or sent to the customer, and that is it is a usable product increment. Okay, so let's look at the case study update for sprint planning and see how this plays out during this sprint planning meeting. So if you just want to pause now, read the case study update on page 200 and going to 201, and then come on back here when you're done. Okay, so you've had a chance to read that. You saw how the Scrum team went through each of the items in the product backlog. Selections were made. The development team selected those that should be included and therefore created the sprint backlog and therefore the sprint goal. So that all happens in that first meeting, generally 2 to 3 hours. The morning of Monday morning is when that takes place. We now move on to the next step, the development work. And as I mentioned previously, this is when most of the work or most of the time of the sprint occurs during the period called development work, so the majority. It is self-directed by the development team. So as I mentioned earlier, the Scrum Master is not managing the development team, actively managing them at this point and telling them what to do. The development team self-directs. So they will have to plan, they'll have to look at their work, they'll have to figure out who's doing what and so on, but it's the responsibility of the development team to do that. The progress is displayed on the Scrum board, often a very simple physical board. Often it's physically created, and it is usually consisting of 3 columns, to do, doing, and done. Now, this was something that you would have seen during Chapter 5, the activity-based schedule using workflow. So you've seen something similar in Chapter 5. If you go back, you'll see an example of this as well. At this point, please turn to your textbook again and turn to the case study on page 202 and read about the sprint development work. Okay, so welcome back after reading that. And again, as you'll see during that reading, or if you watch the video of the case study, you'll see the work being done and the work tracked on the Scrum board. Now, as a sort of subset to the development work, there's something called a daily stand-up meeting that takes place. Daily stand-up meetings are something that happen for 15 minutes every day. And when they say they're stand-up, that literally means there are no chairs in the room, and it is limited to only 15 minutes a day. The purpose of the meeting is to determine the current state of the project. So it is a daily checkpoint of how the project is doing. It is not to solve detailed problems. These are deferred to be discussed outside of this meeting. So at this point, if you would like to pause this video again, go to the textbook on page 203 and read the case study update daily stand-up meeting. So come on back here when you're done. Okay, so in this video or in this case study update, you would have seen the daily stand-up meeting occur. And as part of the daily stand-up meeting, each person on the team reports what they accomplished during the last workday to accomplish the sprint goal, what they plan to accomplish the next workday, and any obstacles that may be blocking them. And it's limited to that. Again, detailed discussion of how to solve problems do not occur during that meeting. Those are taken offline. The Scrum Master is making note of any obstacles because that may be something that he or she does outside of the meeting. It's limited to strictly 15 minutes. Everyone has to be at the meeting and it has to occur every day. So this is a key aspect of development work. Okay, so now let's move on to sprint review. This is now near the end of the sprint. And assuming a 1-week sprint, this would be Friday afternoon would be the sprint review. The product increment is demonstrated. Oftentimes, additional stakeholders are invited to the sprint review. For example, the project sponsor may attend, or other stakeholders of the project may be there to see the product increment. So it's demonstrated by the product team, as indicated here, attended by the Scrum team and other stakeholders, such as the project sponsor. And it's a key way to keep everyone involved up to date because they're seeing that product increment demonstrated at the end of each sprint. So again, please go to the case study update on page 204, and you'll see an example of the sprint review take place. Now, the next and last step is the sprint retrospective. This takes place, the very last thing that is done during the sprint is the sprint retrospective. And what this is this will be familiar to what we learned in chapter 16 in terms of project close. It's like the lessons learned, except done on a sprint basis. Provides an opportunity for the team to determine what went well, what did not go well, and what could be improved during the next sprint. It's similar to lessons learned, as I mentioned earlier, except it's performed more frequently. So it's something that is done now multiple times throughout the project, rather than once, which is traditional project management. Again, if I direct you to page 205, you'll go through the case study update for sprint retrospective. So go and read that and come on back here. Okay, the last step, once all of the sprints have been completed, and there can be anywhere from, any number of sprints can be defined as being part of a project, the project closes. So once all sprints are complete, the project will close. And the processes are similar to traditional project management at that point. For example, a final project report, etc. So it becomes similar in concept to traditional project management. And finally, the last case study update is project closing, which is a very short one at the top of page 206. So please have a look at that. Okay, now quick comparison of traditional and agile project management. Often there's wondering of, well, what is the difference between the two, or what is it? How would we know which one we should choose? And often it's not a choice of completely one or completely the other. There's aspects of Agile that can be used in traditional project management and vice versa. So there's lots of organizations that are uh, merging the two to some extent, and so that becomes a little bit complicated. But let's just look at some of the aspects when we look at traditional and agile project management. Now, the one thing that is needed now, basically in both traditional and agile project management, top management support is needed, but particularly in agile project management, there's an additional need for management support is needed. For example, the uh, the fact that the development team self-manages, the fact that the development team selects the items to a large degree that will be included in each sprint is very different from traditional management, where the managers decide and let the workers know. This is a little bit, or significantly different from that. So support for that sort of bottom-up model is required. So management support of agile is required, an understanding of what it is and supporting it. There's a predictive versus adaptive planning. Traditional project management is predictive. It tries to and attempts through planning to predict when everything is going to exactly occur. There's a schedule for the entire project. Agile, on the other hand, doesn't do that. It adapts. We don't know what will be included in the fourth sprint. We'll only know that when we get to the sprint planning of the fourth sprint. So it adapts as it goes. Now, that's one of the advantages of it, in that it is able to adapt to what we've seen before. In the earlier sprints, the changes can be made and adjustments can be made, and that's one of the reasons why it's very useful for software. But it's very different. It's one thing, again, if we look up to management support, the fact that Agile is adaptive, it's more difficult to absolutely predict or even attempt to predict when certain features will be available. The project team is very different. As you saw before, there's a project manager on traditional project manager. There's a scrum master, and their roles are very different. Project teams usually have job titles and specific functions of each project team member. On Scrum teams, they are more generic, is that they're all called developers, and they will become an increasingly cross-functional, so that different team members will do different functions, not just their one specialty. So it's a different way of organizing the project team. And the project team in Agile is self-directed to a large degree, versus in traditional project management, the project manager directs. Now, quality and risk is listed in that the aspects of quality are important and need to be considered in both traditional and agile project management. So much of what was learned during Chapter 8, which is the quality planning, and Chapter 9, which was the risk planning, is basically true within Agile. So that should be continued. Stakeholder communication, definitely stakeholders need to be communicated with during the traditional projects and agile projects. It's just done a little bit differently. In traditional project management, you would have seen the creation of the communication management plan, and it would have been planned out and so on. Within Agile, it's somewhat in the process that, for example, the existence of the Scrum board is a key communication tool for stakeholders who can visibly see the progress of the project, as well as the sprint review meeting is a key communication tool that will communicate to stakeholders. So stakeholder communication, while important in each, is done a little bit differently. Project procurement is one that is probably more suited to traditional project management. The need for contracts and so on would push it more towards the realm of traditional project management. Though there could be aspects of a procured project that could use Agile, but it's probably more within the domain of traditional project management. So that's an introduction to Agile project management. Thanks, and we'll see you next time.